Hey everyone! So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the common explanations that are given for the supernatural. So I'm taking all of this from David Hufford's book, The Terror That Comes in the Night. If you want to follow along, it's page 13. So this is basically just a lot of the reasons that people tend to use to explain away the supernatural. It's not necessarily right or wrong. It's just a lot of the ways that people tend to talk about it. So I'm just going to go through some of them and talk about them a little bit. So the first one is, and again, this is directly from Hufford, so you can feel free. I'm not stealing his stuff. Please feel free to actually read his book. It's amazing. But the first one is that no first-person account exists for such narratives because in their present form, the current stories have been developed during the oral transmission. So basically what this is saying is that there are sort of no other accounts of this. There's just what's in oral transmission. So you're not going to actually find necessarily written accounts, or you might find written accounts, but they're fictionalized, but they might be based off of the oral tradition. So because you don't find these, sometimes people sometimes people just feel like they're not as legitimate just because there aren't written versions of it. And that's not necessarily true. A lot of things have been passed on in the oral tradition for long periods of time, and it's correct. And it's well known, especially amongst groups who either are very proficient in keeping things orally. I'm thinking in particular of a lot of indigenous groups, but also because sometimes things just shouldn't be written down, right? These are not things that you would write down. You wouldn't share them in that way. So people tell them instead of sharing them, and then they don't end up in written form. That doesn't take away from their legitimacy. That has nothing to do with that. But for some reason, a lot of people feel like if it's not written down, it's not real, which is, it just doesn't work. Another one is that people are actually misinterpreting ordinary events. So they're, because of their imagination or a misinterpretation, they're actually talking about a very ordinary event. And the example Hufford gives are will-o'-the-wisps for swamp gas. Same thing could be said of weather balloons for aliens, those kind of things. So it's just an ordinary thing that people are misinterpreting. So that's another sort of way that people try to explain away the supernatural. Some people actually say it's just unright, like they're just outright lies or errors. So they might be an error of memory, or they might be an error of judgment, or just an error it's not actually a lie, but is just an error in actually interpretation from when you hear it from one person to another. So sometimes they are outright lies. People are just making these things up. Other times they're errors in judgment. So they're not actually a lie. They're just sort of some misinterpretation. So that's another way that people explain away the supernatural. So sometimes too, he lists that people have been have experienced a hoax, or they're a victim of a hoax. So something like you would see, he gives the example of Sleepy Hollow as a story, as being a hoax of someone experiencing the supernatural, but it's not actually supernatural. So that's another sort of version of that, where we explain away the supernatural. Sometimes too, these experiences can be caused intentionally, right? So we actually intentionally put ourselves in a situation in which we can experience something supernatural through something like fasting, use of hallucinogenics, something along those lines, so that you actually put yourself into an altered state in order to achieve a hallucination or to achieve something that you perceive as being supernatural, but it's not actually supernatural according to the people who try to dismiss it. I'm not going to argue that, but that you're actually, you're having this experience because of your perceptions, because of the way you think of these things, the sort of cultural baggage that surrounds those things. You're having those experiences based off of what your culture should tell you that you should have in these situations. And they might be a culturally sanctioned event, or they might not be a culturally sanctioned event. So in some cultures, it is not uncommon to take hallucinogens to actually communicate with the dead or to communicate with the other side. That would fall under this category. But again, a way to explain away the supernatural, and that's not what we're actually trying to do here. And then the last one is that these are experiences that are being reported by people who have mental illness. So that's another way that we tend to explain away the supernatural. We tell people, sometimes we just do it shorthand and say, oh, you're crazy. You didn't really experience the supernatural. You're crazy. which is, of course, incredibly just rude. But also it's very cultural bound as well, right? That we think of mental illness as being one of the only acceptable ways that you could do this, right? And Hufford actually talks about this a little bit too in some later interviews that he did. We talk about people seeing things. Oh, you're seeing things. It's like, well, yeah, we all see things all the time. That's how seeing works if you have sight. So saying you're hearing things is another good example. If you can hear, we hear things all the time. What we're saying when we say you're seeing things, you're hearing things, is you're seeing and hearing things that aren't culturally appropriate, right? That's what we mean when we say that, which is an interesting little shift in language there. So these are just, like I said, all different ways that we kind of explain the supernatural away. We try to say that a supernatural experience isn't happening because of these things. So sometimes people actually, when you're talking to them about your supernatural experience, they kind of go through this list and think that it must be one of those things. You must be mistaken. Somebody must be playing a joke on you. Were you drinking? These are the kind of things that people will say to people who've had supernatural experiences, because these are very deeply encultured in us that it has to be one of these things. It can't be something supernatural. So hopefully that helps you understand a little bit about how the supernatural gets explained away in our culture and in our society. And when we can't explain it away, that's when things get interesting.